This video response is going to go out to Mike Winger and to all of my students. And that is because Mr. Winger has uploaded a video entitled, "What the Bible Teaches About Borrowing." The hyperlink to this particular video is in the description below. But it's not the only hyperlink you're going to find down there. You're going to find lots of hyperlinks. Okay? So bear with me on this. Okay? Now, I personally have watched several of your videos, and I found them to be quite informative. However, okay, and yes, I'll stop right here before I go on and say, I even started recommending your videos to a lot of my students. Okay? So, up until now, I've had a certain admiration for your presentations. You sound pretty knowledgeable. Now, I don't know what kind of degrees you have, I don't know what kind of information you have, the whole 9 yards, but up until now, I've rather admired your presentations. But this one I had a lot of disagreement with, as you have already seen, and so it forced me to make this presentation. You say, well, why did it force you to make this kind of a presentation? Well, now I'm going to answer that question. A couple of my students sent me this particular video and asked me the following question. Why should we continue to watch your videos, meaning mine, why should my students continue watching my videos and learning what I've presented to them if they can solve their financial problems with a loan? They also told me that they were very depressed because they thought that there was no hope of them ever paying back their loans. This really hurt me. It really did. So, I took the time and I watched your video, the whole presentation. But before I continue, I would like to note that I am not only speaking to you, Mr. Winger, but also to all of my students. So, from time to time, I may end up speaking to you in the third person rather than in the first person. And that could get a little confusing, and I would like to apologize in advance for the confusion. So, you have my deepest apologies for flipping over to the third person rather than the first. I'm sorry about that. I'll try to do my best, but, you know, I'm not perfect. I really am not. And you'll find this out. Okay. So, where did all of my students get these ridiculous ideas? It is because of the way you made your presentation. Okay? It's not necessarily the words you spoke, it's the way the whole topic was presented. Okay? And I'll illustrate this. I personally feel that you have made the same mistake in your presentation that I did myself in a similar presentation with a gentleman by the name of Jeff Bliss. Now, if you don't know who that is, that was an 18-year-old high school dropout who went back to school and threw a tirade in a classroom because he wasn't being properly educated. And you can look this up for yourself. Go right ahead. Okay. Now, when I watched the video about Jeff Bliss, I immediately reacted. And in a way, I erroneously reacted. And I'll illustrate this. I failed to realize that Jeff Bliss knew nothing about Roman honor challenges or Roman forums. Had he known all this, there's a good chance he would have never thrown that tirade in that classroom. And I didn't know this. So I hyper-criticized him for throwing a tirade in a classroom. That was erroneous of me. Because of this, I finally went on the air. I actually had one of my students come to me and say, you know what? You're presuming that he knew about Roman forums and Roman honor challenges. Do you know that he knows these things? I'm like, well, no, I really don't. I never really asked him. And so that student said, well, before you criticize him again, make sure he knows all this. So I actually took the time and I uploaded a video about Roman honor challenges and Roman forums. And now he and everybody else knows. So maybe next time he won't throw a tirade in a classroom. And I even apologized to Jeff Bliss for that particular error. I definitely disagreed with what he did. But now I can understand, I can comprehend why he did it, because he would have never known all this stuff. Okay? So, anyway, I think you, Mr. Winger, are used to speaking to a study group. Okay? But that's fine. I mean, I speak to my friends, you spoke to yours. Those people know who you are, they know your teaching methods, they know how you think. That's great. Okay? However, and of course they're used to your teaching methods. Your study group is used to your teaching methods, just like my group is used to mine. But you're on YouTube now, and that's a huge difference. Okay? It's a very different ball game. Many of my students watch just a fraction of the videos that they find. I've discovered this in my own analytics. If you will go to your YouTube analytics and take a look at the watch time of your presentations, you're going to find out just how long they're watching your presentations. And sometimes it's not very long at all. Now, in this particular video that you uploaded, I watched it several times to make all of these notes. You see, I got a ton of notes here. So, yeah, I watched quite a bit of your presentation. I watched it over and over and made note after note and corrected this and corrected that. Yeah, I went through a lot of research to make this presentation. So as you can see, I'm not just throwing something up on the air. All right, I carefully considered and studied what you said, which is a far cry from what my students did. And I will be making a separate presentation on how to make presentations like this on YouTube, or even if you go into a forum, how to make a proper presentation in a forum, because my students aren't that great at that kind of stuff. They don't have as great of communication skills as I have, so on and so forth, and I'll get into that later. But I will be uploading a separate For My Students video about good communication skills and how to make a good presentation, and even some mistakes that I made. I actually went into a forum and I made several mistakes of my own, and I will demonstrate those mistakes, literally. Because I did a lot of things. I didn't do everything wrong, but I did do several things wrong, and if I had done them right in the first place, the discussion wouldn't have gone on as long as it did. And that's my fault. So I'll get into that in another video. Okay, so if you want to watch it, let me know, and when I get it uploaded, I'll let you know. Okay? Now, if my students, like they just did, watch just a small fraction of your presentation, it's very easy for them to incorrectly presume what you're stating. And that's exactly what's happened here. That's why I had to finally get on the air. Alright? What you say and what they hear can actually be two entirely different things. And I'll prove that right here. Okay? Now, I presume that you, Mr. Winger, have incorrectly presumed that everybody knows what you know. I've done that so many times. I've made the same mistake when I started uploading videos. When I started uploading videos, I assumed that everybody had a basic understanding of algebra. Was I ever wrong? And as I said, what you say and what other people hear may be two entirely different things. Okay? The intellectual diversity of the students that are on my YouTube channel, I have over 1,400, clearly proves my point. Some of them are very smart, some of them not so much. Okay? So when I create my presentations nowadays, I don't presume that my students know anything at all. I just assume that they're no better than preschoolers. Now, that doesn't mean that they are. I just presume them that, and it makes my presentations easier for them to comprehend. I've got some pretty intelligent people on my channel, but I also have people that are less intelligent, so I cater to everybody. Okay? So I presume nothing. Okay? I hope that in the future, when you upload a presentation, you will take this advice and you will listen to the fact that these people watching your videos may only be watching a fraction of them and not the whole thing, and they may be getting some incorrect ideas based on the portion of the video that they're watching from you. And I'll clearly illustrate how this happened. Okay? So keep that in mind when you upload future presentations. Now, the first student that sent me your video right now is having financial difficulties. Okay? Up until now, he's been watching my videos and learning whatever he could from me. Then he listened to the 4th minute of your video presentation. What did you say? And I'm going to quote it word for word. When we look at the text, God never expressly forbids borrowing. You go on to say that Jesus actually commands us to lend. So what was the student's response? Well, since God doesn't forbid borrowing, then God endorses borrowing. That means it's just like a driver's license. Now I'm handing you a driver's license and you can just go out and get all the loans you want. Go over there to the cash advance store. Don't worry about the consequences. That's what he heard. Now, a similar idea is presented in Matthew chapter 12, verse 30. So the student went on to say, therefore, I can borrow money anytime I get into financial trouble. So why do I need to learn anything further from you, meaning me? Okay. Now, take a moment to compare what you said, Mr. Winger, and what my students heard. Now, to my students, do any of you watching this video see a problem with this? I do, but it gets worse. The second student that sent me this particular video is in a lot of debt right now. His financial situation is grim. Up until now, he has been listening to me. Then he sent me this particular video. He said he listened to the 2nd minute of the video. And what did you, Mr. Winger, say in that particular minute? This changes how I get a home, if I ever get a home. And for most of us, that means never owning a home. You go on to say, sometimes for people, borrowing is how they're going to get by. What did my student hear? Despite what you're teaching us, we will never get out of debt. Again, what you say and what they heard are two different things. Now, before I go on here, I would like to state that I have never been in any debt. Ever. In 48 years, I have never, ever been in any debt whatsoever. Now you say, wait a minute, how did you buy your cars? How did you buy your homes? Well, I didn't buy the nicest home, obviously, and I didn't buy the nicest car either. What I did was I took some very sound advice from somebody a long time ago who said, when you fill out your W-4, put a 0 exemption in it for 2 reasons. Number 1, because the government tends to change the rules in the middle of the year about taxes, and when they do, then the refund you think you're going to get at the end may end up being something you owe to the government instead. But by putting the 0 exemption in there, you're throwing so much at the government that if they need extra, they just take it right out, and you don't get in any trouble. You don't have the IRS calling you or nothing. But the second reason is, you don't spend money you never get. Let me say that again. You don't spend money you never get. Therefore, at the end of the year, when the tax refunds came in, I have an older sister. We took both of our tax returns, we pooled them together, we both bought cars, we both bought this house, and there you go. But that's not the course I want my students to take, although I will say to my students, yes, that's a very good idea to put a 0 exemption on your W-4. You may not get a whole lot in your paycheck throughout the year, but the tax refund will more than pay for itself. I guarantee it. Okay? So this is very good, sound financial advice. That's how I did it. But I want my students to go one step further. The main reason they're in poverty is because of their lack of education. And I'll get into that a little later on in this presentation. Okay. Now, after watching your presentation, a question came up in my head. Will the atheist take advantage of this particular video and start claiming that God is too poor to take care of his followers? I can only presume that that's exactly what they're going to do. And I bet a few of them are watching this video right now expecting me to confirm that God is too poor to take care of his followers. Huh. I'm sorry to disappoint them, but they'll get no satisfaction from me on that one. They'll have to wait a long time to hear that one. Yeah, it'll be long after I'm gone. Okay, so what is the first thing the atheists are going to do? They're going to grab a hold of Matthew 5:42 and say, hey, you can't deny this. And I'm not going to. Now they'll say, well, you can't deny what was said in Luke 6:35. I'm not going to deny that either. But how can people like me convince other people that God isn't too poor to take care of his followers and biblically justify loans? Well, we have to use something called hermeneutics to do this. Now, what do I know about hermeneutics? First of all, I'm a speed reader, a memory expert. I know Latin, I know Italian, I know accounting, I know high-end mathematics. All you have to do is look through my videos. You'll see this for yourself. I actually watched a 6-hour presentation on hermeneutics given by a Christian college professor on YouTube, and I'll list the hyperlink down here for that. I also took the time to read these two books. This one's called Prophet and Teacher by William Herzog. And this is Biblical Exegesis in the Apostolic Period, written by Richard N. Longenecker. So I kind of do know what I'm talking about here. I may be no expert at it, but I actually took the time and wrote a book about hermeneutics based on what I read out of those books. So, alright. Now, after I watched your presentation, I did additional research. I discovered several things that I never saw in your presentation. So, in this presentation, I will present all the data that I found that I didn't see in your presentation, and if anyone watching this finds additional data for me to analyze and interpret and process and so on and so forth, leave that down here in the comments below. I'd love to read it. I'd love to analyze it. Okay, so let's start with Deuteronomy 8:4. According to what I read, the Israelites had everything they needed, literally. So, by Euclidean logic, if this is the case, why would they need to acquire a loan? A similar situation was presented in Acts chapter 4. Take a look at verses 33 through 35. Again, I have to ask, through Euclidean logic, why would anyone in that situation need a loan? The point I'm trying to establish is that this is biblical proof that you can live debt-free if you choose to do so. I certainly have, and I believe my students can also. I have literally lived the life that says you can. And I believe that my students can do the same thing. If I didn't believe it, I wouldn't say it. I wouldn't stake my reputation on it. Now, having said that, I personally believe that this clearly refutes what you, Mr. Winger, said, and for most of us that means never owning a home. I don't believe it, and there's no way you're going to convince me otherwise. Period. But I can reinforce this idea. Now let's take a look at Matthew chapter 17 through verses 24 through 27. If God can send a fish to Jesus if God can send a fish to Jesus which had a coin in its mouth, he can certainly supply the needs of anybody who needs it. I just can't be convinced otherwise. That's clear proof. Now, you, Mr. Winger, cited Deuteronomy chapter 15, verse 6. The first question that comes to my mind is, how can you lend to many nations if you have to borrow from someone? How do you loan when you're already in debt? That's simple Euclidean logic. But let's take this one step further. It says you will lend to many nations, but you will borrow from none. Who are you not going to borrow from? Those many nations. The very nations you're lending to. Why didn't God want the Israelites to borrow from those nations? Because they were pagan, that's why. And they would have enforced pagan rituals onto the Israelites, and God did not want that to happen. Okay? So, this is the first indication that God is very picky about who you borrow from. No question about it. Then you cite, Mr. Winger, you cite Exodus chapter 22, verse 25. This brings up an interesting point. The Israelites were never commanded by God to loan money to anyone. Notice the word if. If you loan, that doesn't mean you absolutely have to loan to anyone. Okay? Obviously, they could if they wanted to. So, what you said in your presentation about God doesn't forbid loaning and borrowing, well, He doesn't. However, the if statement says you don't have to loan just because somebody asks you. Okay? Now then, so, what is the modern day equivalent of this particular statement? Well, the statement is this. Most lenders today assess your credit score. If you don't have a very good credit score, they don't lend to you. And that could be a huge problem if you get into a financial fix. This is something that my students should factor in their decision if they ever decide to pursue a loan. I will grant, however, that God set ground rules on lending money. This is true. Okay, we can see this in Deuteronomy chapter 23. We see that. Now, I'll get into that later. So, obviously, God is not totally opposed to granting loans. What happened to the Israelites when they didn't follow God's ground rules? Well, you can find that in Nehemiah chapter 5, verses 1 through 13. It wasn't a very pleasant situation. What else did the Bible say about loans? Let's take a look at Proverbs 22:7. If you look at the scripture carefully, you have to come to the realization that people in the United States would find that absolutely repulsive. Really. But to be fair, no one should use this particular scripture to insist that God is opposed to loans. After all, it was Solomon who wrote this, and Solomon wasn't quoting God. So therefore, you can't use this as a defense. Now, before we continue this presentation, we have to establish a vital fact. Jews and Christians in the first century were members of an agrarian society. What does that mean? They were farmers. That's why. Well, not all of them were farmers, but they were part of a farming community. This was clearly taught in the book Prophet and Teacher by William Herzog. William Herzog. Or no. Yeah, William Herzog. Okay. Remember, back then there were no banks, no cash advance stores. Usually the people that you were acquiring your loans from in that day were your literal next door neighbors. This is clearly illustrated in Deuteronomy chapter 23, verse 19. How well do any of you students watching this right now know your next door neighbor? Would you go up to your next door neighbor and ask him for a loan? And even if you did, would he grant it to you without interest? Think about it. In an agrarian society, the success of the population was dependent on the success of every single individual in that population. So, it was in your neighbor's best interest that you succeeded in life. Does that describe your neighbors right now, your literal next-door neighbors? I don't think so. Jesus himself definitely had an opinion about who you should obtain your loans from. Remember Matthew chapter 18, verses 21 through 35? The parable had two messages. The first was, don't hold a loan over someone else's head. You presented that very well, Mr. Winger, and so I'm doing the same. Remember, everyone owes a debt to God that is greater than what any person owes to us. And the second lesson was that you were not to acquire a loan from just anyone. Do you really want someone to hold a debt over you for the rest of your life? I don't think so. So while we're on the subject, we need to bring up two things. The first is a parable from Jesus. This comes from Matthew chapter 25, verses 14 through 30. This brings up a good question. How can you invest money while having a loan floating over your head? Two ain't kosher. Then there's Matthew chapter 22, verses 15 through 22. What was the point of this story? Pagan coins had pagan images stamped on them. Jesus didn't want those coins in his temple. You can find a similar concept in a letter that was written by Thomas Jefferson to the Danbury, Connecticut Baptist Society. I'll say that again. Thomas Jefferson wrote the letter. He sent it to the Danbury, Connecticut Baptist Society. So why would Jesus want Christians to grant loans to people? Obviously not for profit, because we already saw that in the Old Testament. Let's take a look at the Lord's Prayer. Forgive us our debts as we forgive those who are indebted to us. Those words say it all. Christians had confidence back then that if someone was unable to repay a loan to God, to us, that God would compensate us for the unpaid loan. We can see this in Luke chapter 6, verse 30. So if it wasn't for profit, why did Jesus want Christians to grant loans? Probably for the same reason that he presented 19 financial parables before he was crucified. These loans were used to teach people good financial planning. They could also be used to gain the trust of those facing overwhelming financial difficulty. Obviously, people couldn't trust the Pharisees or the Sadducees. That's because they held the loans over people's heads. And could they trust the Roman Empire? Certainly not. We have the Roman 12 tables that clearly illustrate this. If you don't believe me, look at, there's a hyperlink down here below that shows the Roman 12 tables. Take a look, particularly at table number 3. Of course, I have to cover a web article that I also discovered, and I'm going to put a hyperlink to it down here in the description below as well. And that's because I know that some of my students may discover this particular web article for themselves. And if they do, they may learn the wrong lesson. Is there a hidden financial message in the crucifixion of Jesus? I believe there is. And of course, this story says so. But you may learn the wrong lesson. It isn't that you should bail a person out from a bad loan, which you could if you wanted to, but it's that you should keep people from getting themselves involved in these kind of bad loans in the first place. And how do you do this? By doing the same thing Jesus did. He taught people sound financial planning. He fellowshiped with people. He helped people whenever he could. Isn't that what we're supposed to do based on the parable of the Good Samaritan? Let's keep in mind that education in the first century was very different than it is today. Back then, people had to pay scribes to obtain an education. Today, you can find a YouTube video that usually can teach you what you need to learn. And YouTube videos are usually free. See the difference? But let's focus on the education I provide on my YouTube channel. Most people today have very little time to watch a video or even read a book. Let's suppose I ask my students to read the book Currency Wars by James Rickards. There are 318 pages in that particular book. How long do you think it would take many of my students to read the book? Now, before I go on here, I know you say, well, you're shouting so much. That's because of the audio on my camera. It has nothing to do with me wanting to shout. It's just my audio is not all that great. So, let's go on. First, you have to consider that many of them have short attention spans and their eyes wander across the pages of the text. If their eyes wander across the page, they won't read very fast. That's why I taught my students speed reading. But let's say they speed read the book. If they can't remember what they read, the information in the book would be useless to them. That's why I taught them how to memorize things. If while they are reading the book, they have to constantly consult a dictionary, they will read very slowly. That's why I taught them how to read and write in the Italian language. Okay. Now, back in 1994, I had learned how to speed read, and the very first book I ever sped read was this one, the Memory Book by Harry Lorraine. But in the speed reading, it says you have to have a rather extensive dictionary in your head in order to read quicker. Well, was I going to memorize a 10,000-word dictionary? Absolutely not. So somebody gave me a 1932 Latin reader. And they said that 60% of the English language came from a region known as Latium in Italy, specifically from a town called Alba Longa, which means a long row of trees. Okay? The Phoenicians were living in that area, and they created the Latin language. Well, at that time, the Internet was in its infancy. Back in 1994, the Internet was in its infancy, and my library didn't have very good reading materials, and the books that I needed to decipher the Latin were very cost prohibitive from the bookstore. So what I did was I went to the closest source, which was How to Learn Italian, which was available in my library. I learned Italian, used that as a secret decoder ring to decode the Latin book, and now I have the dictionary in my head. That's how I did that. Now, if my students can't perform basic mathematics, they won't be able to read financial charts properly. That's why I taught them math. Is there anything else that I didn't see in your presentation, Mr. Winger? Yes, the New Testament Greek word for debt, which is this one right here, also happens to be one of the 33 words for sin. Is debt in itself a sin? Not particularly, but it can lead you to do a lot of things that can actually lead you to sin. You can become desperate and seek money-making opportunities that may be detrimental to your physical or emotional well-being. I could go on, but I'll leave that to your imagination. I'll present a couple of final notes, and then I will finish this video. When people present Matthew chapter 5, verse 42, they miss a couple of valuable themes. In hermeneutics, you have to ask a few questions. Who was talking in Matthew chapter 5, verse 42? That would be Jesus. Who was he talking to? The disciples. What was the central theme of the verse? Don't turn away needy people. So Jesus wasn't commanding the disciples to grant loans. He was commanding them to meet the needs of those who were in need. That's classic hermeneutics right there. It really is. Okay? What he was saying was, he wasn't saying, go find every person that needs a loan and give it to them. He was saying, if somebody comes to you with a need, don't turn the need away. That's what he was really saying. So what was the other theme? The other theme is whether you give financially strapped people the things they need or you loan them the money or other goods, as a Christian you are required to maintain fellowship with those people. To your credit, Mr. Winger, you did bring this up in your presentation. If a loan is jeopardizing your fellowship with the person you loaned the goods to, forgive the loan. This is what was stated in the Lord's Prayer. God will compensate the person granting the loan for the unpaid debt. The Lord's Prayer guarantees this. Although I agree with some of the points that you, Mr. Winger, have made in your video, I found your presentation very anachronistic. Who did Jesus want people to get loans from? Not the Pharisees and the Sadducees, not the Romans, not the Old Testament Philistines, but from each other. And that's because those kind of people would say, hey, look, if you're in that much debt and you can't get out, I'm just going to go ahead and forgive you. And I'm not going to destroy our fellowship because of this loan. That's why. In this video, I've demonstrated that some of my students have drawn the wrong conclusions from your video, and that's why I had to address this here. That's why I performed so much research. Now, as everybody knows, I'm no expert at hermeneutics, okay? I've learned it, I'm starting to use it now, and if I had used it properly a little while ago, I probably wouldn't have gotten into the mess that I got into not that long ago. And I'll explain that in another video. But, as everybody knows here, I'm a data processor. I work with the data I have available to me. If people have additional data, please send it my way. I'd like to read it, I'd like to analyze it, and like to draw some conclusions from it based on what I already know. Okay? So, if you have that additional data, by all means, leave it down here in the comments below. I am thrilled to read anything you got. Okay? Thank you, Mr. Winger, for watching this video presentation. It was a pleasure to do this. Will I watch any more of your presentations? Probably so. But I'd like to see you take what I've said, analyze it, watch the whole video, and let me know what you think. And by all means, load up a video presentation. I'd love to see it. Alright, I will tell everybody more things in a future video, so I'd like for you to stay tuned.